Ma'am, which floor are you headed?
28th, please. I live here.
What kind of work do you do?
I work in law at the federal courthouse.
Let me see some identification.
Here it is. Everything is correct.
Doesn't look
You are
right.
detaining me without cause.
The elevator doors slid shut with a soft mechanical hum, sealing Judge Patricia Williams inside the cramped space with two police officers who had no idea they were about to destroy their own lives. It was 9:15 on a Tuesday evening, and Patricia was returning home from a long day at the federal courthouse, where she had presided over cases that would determine the fate of criminals, corrupt officials, and civil rights violations. She lived quietly in the upscale Meridian Towers apartment complex, a place where residents paid premium prices for security, privacy, and the kind of respectful treatment that came with affluent living. What happened next would shatter that illusion completely and prove that even a federal judge wearing her judicial robes wasn't immune to the ugliest forms of prejudice that still poisoned American society. The security footage would capture every devastating second of an encounter that would end two police careers, spark a federal investigation, and send shockwaves through the entire justice system. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button, because what unfolds over the next few minutes will leave you absolutely speechless. Trust me, you won't want to miss how this plays out. Judge Patricia Williams had spent the last 16 years building an impeccable reputation on the federal bench. At 53 years old, she was known for her sharp legal mind, unwavering commitment to justice, and the respect she commanded from lawyers, prosecutors, and fellow judges across the district. Her journey to the federal courthouse hadn't been easy. Growing up in a working-class family, she had fought for every opportunity, excelling in law school, working her way up through the prosecutor's office, and eventually earning her appointment to the federal bench through sheer determination and exceptional legal expertise. Patricia lived alone in apartment 2847 of the Meridian Towers, a luxury high-rise that housed doctors, executives, and other professionals who valued the building's reputation for discretion and security. She had moved there 5 years earlier, drawn by the promise of a peaceful environment where she could decompress from the intensity of federal court proceedings. The building's management prided itself on providing residents with a sanctuary from the outside world, complete with 24-hour concierge service, private elevator access, and a strict policy against unauthorized personnel entering the residential floors. That Tuesday evening had been particularly grueling. Patricia had spent over 12 hours reviewing complex fraud cases, listening to arguments in a high-profile corruption trial, and drafting opinions that would affect thousands of people. She was exhausted, looking forward to nothing more than changing out of her judicial robes, ordering dinner, and catching up on some reading before bed. She had no idea that her quiet evening was about to become a nightmare that would expose the dark underbelly of police misconduct and racial profiling at its absolute worst. Officers Marcus Rodriguez and Kevin Thompson were supposed to be responding to a noise complaint on the 14th floor. A resident had called in about loud music coming from apartment 1426, and building security had requested police assistance after their initial attempts to resolve the issue had failed. Rodriguez, a 7-year veteran of the force, and Thompson, with 12 years of experience, had handled dozens of similar calls throughout their careers. It should have been a routine visit, the kind of mundane police work that filled most of their shifts without incident or drama. But something went wrong the moment they entered the building. The concierge, a young man named David Chen who had been working the night shift for only 3 weeks, made a critical error that would set off a chain of events with devastating consequences. When the officers asked about the noise complaint, Chen misunderstood their question and directed them to the wrong floor entirely. Instead of taking the elevator to the 14th floor where the actual complaint originated, Rodriguez and Thompson found themselves heading to the 28th floor, where Judge Patricia Williams lived in peaceful silence. The elevator ride that changed everything began innocuously enough. Patricia had entered first, pressing the button for her floor, and settling back against the wall with her briefcase and purse. She was still wearing her black judicial robe, having decided to change clothes once she reached her apartment rather than using the courthouse facilities. The robe was a symbol of her authority, and the respect she commanded in her professional life. But it would prove powerless against the prejudice she was about to face. Rodriguez and Thompson stepped into the elevator just as the doors were beginning to close. They noticed Patricia immediately, their eyes scanning her appearance with the kind of scrutiny that she had learned to recognize over the years. She offered a polite nod, the kind of courteous acknowledgement that people in professional buildings typically exchanged, but neither officer responded. Instead, they positioned themselves in a way that made the small elevator space feel suddenly cramped and intimidating. Patricia pressed herself against the back wall, a subtle defensive move born from years of navigating spaces where her presence seemed to make others uncomfortable. She had experienced this feeling countless times throughout her career, that moment when she could sense someone questioning whether she really belonged in a particular place or position. But this felt different. This felt more aggressive, more threatening than the usual microaggressions she had learned to endure in professional settings. As the elevator began its slow ascent, Officer Rodriguez broke the silence with a question that immediately set Patricia on edge. He asked her what floor she was going to, despite the fact that she had already pressed the button and the elevator was clearly heading to the 28th floor. The question seemed innocent enough on the surface, but the tone carried an undertone of suspicion that made Patricia's pulse quicken. She responded politely, explaining that she lived on the 28th floor and was heading home from work. Rodriguez and Thompson exchanged a look that Patricia caught in her peripheral vision, a silent communication that suggested they found her answer somehow questionable or suspicious. Thompson then asked what kind of work she did, a question that had no legitimate purpose given the circumstances, but seemed designed to challenge her right to be in the building. Patricia hesitated for just a moment, weighing her options. She could have simply said she worked in law, which was technically accurate but vague enough to avoid complications. She could have mentioned that she was a federal judge, which might have immediately changed the dynamic, but could also come across as name-dropping or trying to intimidate the officers. Or she could have politely declined to answer, pointing out that she had no obligation to discuss her personal life with strangers in an elevator. She chose the middle path, explaining that she worked in the legal field and was returning home from the federal courthouse. It was a truthful answer that provided some context, without being overly specific or confrontational. But instead of satisfying the officer's curiosity, her response seemed to increase their suspicion. Rodriguez stepped closer, invading her personal space in a way that made the already small elevator feel claustrophobic and threatening. The elevator continued its climb, each floor bringing them closer to what should have been Patricia's safe haven, but was instead becoming the stage for a confrontation that would expose the worst aspects of racial profiling in law enforcement. Patricia could feel the tension building, could sense that something was about to go terribly wrong. Her years on the federal bench had given her an acute awareness of power dynamics and the signs of escalating conflict, and every instinct was telling her that these officers were looking for a reason to detain or confront her. What happened next would be captured in crystal clear detail by the elevator's security camera, providing indisputable evidence of an encounter that would shock the legal community and prove that racial profiling remained a persistent and destructive force in American policing. Thompson moved even closer, his badge catching the fluorescent light as he positioned himself directly in front of Patricia. He demanded to see her identification, claiming that building security had reported suspicious activity on the upper floors. The lie rolled off his tongue with practiced ease, the kind of fabricated justification that bad cops had been using for decades to harass innocent people. Patricia knew immediately that no such report existed, but she also understood the dangerous game being played in that confined space. She calmly reached into her purse and produced her driver's license, handing it to Thompson with steady hands despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Thompson studied the ID with exaggerated scrutiny, taking far longer than necessary to read information that should have taken seconds to process. He showed it to Rodriguez, who squinted at the photograph and then at Patricia's face, as if comparing a suspect's mugshot to determine identity. The license clearly showed Patricia's address as apartment 2,847 inches, the Meridian Towers, confirming that she lived exactly where she claimed to live. But instead of returning the identification and apologizing for the misunderstanding, Thompson pocketed the license and informed Patricia that they needed to verify her residency with building management. This was another fabrication, another excuse to extend an encounter that should have ended the moment her identity was confirmed. Patricia's legal mind immediately recognized the constitutional violations taking place. She was being detained without probable cause, questioned without justification, and now having her identification confiscated by officers who had no legitimate authority to do so. But she also knew that challenging police officers in a confined space could escalate the situation in dangerous and unpredictable ways. She had seen too many cases where asserting one's rights had led to charges of resisting arrest or assault on an officer. Rodriguez pressed the emergency stop button, bringing the elevator to a jarring halt between the 22nd and 23rd floors. The sudden stop threw Patricia slightly off balance, and she had to steady herself against the wall. The officers now had her trapped in a space roughly 6 feet by 4 feet, with no witnesses and no immediate way for her to escape or call for help. Thompson began questioning Patricia about her work schedule, asking why she was returning home so late and whether she had been drinking. The questions were designed to be humiliating, to make her feel like a criminal suspect rather than a federal judge returning from a day of serving justice. Patricia answered each question with professional composure, explaining that federal court proceedings often ran late and that she had been working on case opinions until just before leaving the courthouse. The officers seemed frustrated by her calm responses, as if they had expected her to become defensive or agitated. Rodriguez accused her of being evasive, claiming that her answers sounded rehearsed and suspicious. He suggested that she might be involved in illegal activity in the building, perhaps drug dealing or prostitution. The accusations were so absurd and offensive that Patricia had to bite her tongue to prevent herself from responding with the righteous anger that any innocent person would feel when faced with such degrading treatment. Thompson pulled out his radio and began speaking to dispatch, reporting that they had detained a suspicious individual who was attempting to gain unauthorized access to the residential floors. Everything he said was a complete fabrication, but Patricia realized that he was creating a false narrative that would justify whatever actions they took next. She understood that her word against theirs would carry little weight if the situation escalated to formal complaints or legal proceedings. Patricia made a decision that would prove to be crucial. She activated the voice recording app on her smartphone, which was still in her hand from when she had been checking messages earlier. The phone was positioned naturally at her side, and the officers didn't notice that she had begun documenting their every word. Years of legal experience had taught her the vital importance of evidence, and she instinctively understood that audio documentation might be her only protection against whatever false charges these officers might attempt to file. Rodriguez demanded that Patricia empty her purse onto the elevator floor, claiming that they needed to search for weapons or contraband. This demand crossed yet another constitutional line, as the officers had no probable cause to conduct a search and no warrant authorizing them to examine her personal belongings. Patricia calmly refused, explaining that she had committed no crime and that they had no legal authority to search her possessions. Her refusal to comply with the illegal search demand seemed to enrage Thompson. He grabbed Patricia's purse and dumped its contents onto the elevator floor himself, scattering her wallet, keys, makeup, medications, and personal items across the small space. Among the scattered belongings was her federal judicial identification card, which clearly identified her as the Honorable Patricia Williams, United States District Judge for the Northern District. Thompson picked up the judicial ID and stared at it for several seconds, his face cycling through expressions of confusion, disbelief, and growing panic. He showed the card to Rodriguez, whose reaction was even more dramatic. The color drained from Rodriguez's face as he realized they had just detained, harassed, and illegally searched a federal judge. The very person whose courtroom they might someday find themselves standing in as defendants had just been subjected to treatment that would make national headlines and destroy their careers. But instead of immediately apologizing and ending the encounter, the officers made a decision that transformed their mistake from a career-ending blunder into a criminal act. Thompson claimed the judicial ID was fake, suggesting that Patricia had obtained it illegally to impersonate a federal judge. Rodriguez agreed, saying that someone like her couldn't possibly hold such an important position and that they needed to arrest her for fraud and false impersonation of a federal official. The accusations revealed the depth of their racial prejudice and their inability to accept that a black woman could occupy one of the most prestigious and powerful positions in the American legal system, even when confronted with official identification that proved Patricia's identity and authority. Their biases prevented them from acknowledging the truth. They would rather believe an elaborate criminal conspiracy than accept that they had targeted someone who outranked them in every conceivable way. Patricia's voice remained steady as she informed the officers that their detention of her was illegal, their search was unconstitutional, and their accusations were defamatory. She warned them that continuing their current course of action would result in federal charges and the complete destruction of their law enforcement careers. But her warnings fell on deaf ears, as the officers had committed themselves to a path that would lead to their professional annihilation. Thompson radioed for backup, reporting that they had arrested a suspect for impersonating a federal judge and requesting additional units to transport her to jail for booking. The radio transmission would later become crucial evidence in the federal investigation, as it documented the officers' decision to double down on their illegal behavior rather than admit their mistake and apologize. Rodriguez restarted the elevator, but instead of allowing Patricia to continue to her apartment, he directed it toward the ground floor where additional officers would be waiting to arrest her. As the elevator descended, Patricia continued recording every word, knowing that the audio evidence would be essential in proving the extent of the officers' misconduct and the complete absence of any justification for their actions. The elevator reached the ground floor with a mechanical ding that sounded like a death knell for Rodriguez and Thompson's careers. As the doors slid open, Patricia found herself face-to-face with 4 additional officers who had responded to Thompson's fabricated emergency call. The lobby of Meridian Towers, typically a serene space of marble floors and soft lighting, suddenly transformed into an impromptu crime scene, complete with flashing police radios and the kind of commotion that wealthy residents paid premium prices to avoid. Detective Sarah Mitchell was the first to step forward, her 15 years of experience immediately telling her that something wasn't right about this situation. She had worked with Rodriguez and Thompson before and knew them to be competent officers, but the scene unfolding before her raised immediate red flags. Here was a well-dressed woman in professional attire being treated like a dangerous criminal, her personal belongings scattered across an elevator floor, her dignity stripped away in front of building staff and curious residents who had emerged from their apartments to see what was causing the disturbance. Patricia stepped out of the elevator with the same composed dignity she brought to her courtroom every day. Despite having endured nearly 20 minutes of harassment, illegal detention, and racist accusations, she maintained the professional demeanor that had earned her respect throughout the federal judicial system. Her calm presence stood in stark contrast to the aggressive energy radiating from Rodriguez and Thompson, who seemed increasingly desperate to justify their actions to the growing crowd of witnesses. Detective Mitchell approached Patricia with a measured tone, asking for her side of the story. It was clear that the detective sensed the incongruity between the officer's claims and the evidence of her own eyes. Patricia handed over her judicial identification card, which Mitchell examined carefully under the bright lobby lights. The detective's expression shifted dramatically as she realized she was looking at authentic federal credentials belonging to one of the most powerful jurists in the district. Thompson immediately interjected, insisting that the identification was counterfeit and demanding that Mitchell arrest Patricia for federal impersonation charges. His voice carried a note of panic that everyone present could hear, the sound of a man who knew he had made a catastrophic mistake but was too proud or too stupid to admit it. Rodriguez backed up his partner's claims, adding details to their fabricated story about suspicious behavior and false credentials. But Detective Mitchell wasn't buying their narrative. She pulled out her phone and made a call that would seal the officer's fate forever. Within minutes, she had contacted the federal courthouse and confirmed not only Patricia's identity, but also her current status as a sitting judge who had been presiding over cases that very day. The voice on the other end of the line expressed shock and concern that a federal judge had been detained and harassed, promising that the incident would be investigated at the highest levels. The lobby fell silent as Mitchell ended her call and turned to face Rodriguez and Thompson. Her voice was cold and professional as she informed them that they had just committed career suicide. Patricia Williams was indeed a federal judge. Her credentials were authentic, and their detention of her constituted a federal civil rights violation that would be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. The color drained from both officers' faces as the reality of their situation finally penetrated their racist assumptions. Patricia chose that moment to reveal that she had recorded the entire encounter, from the initial questioning in the elevator to their continued harassment after discovering her judicial credentials. She calmly informed the assembled officers that every word, every illegal action, and every constitutional violation had been captured in crystal clear audio that would be turned over to federal investigators. The recording would prove that their treatment of her had nothing to do with legitimate police work and everything to do with racial prejudice and abuse of power. The building's security director, James Walsh, emerged from his office with a grim expression and a laptop computer. The building's elevator cameras had captured the entire incident in high-definition video, providing visual evidence to complement Patricia's audio recording. Walsh explained that the footage clearly showed Rodriguez and Thompson harassing a resident without justification, conducting an illegal search, and fabricating charges when their victim's identity was revealed. By now, word of the incident had reached the highest levels of both the police department and the federal judiciary. Patricia's phone began ringing with calls from fellow judges, court administrators, and legal colleagues who had heard rumors about what had happened. Each call added another layer of pressure on the police department to take immediate and decisive action against the officers responsible for this unprecedented violation. Rodriguez made one final desperate attempt to salvage the situation, suggesting that Patricia had somehow provoked the encounter or that their actions were justified by standard police procedures. His words fell flat in the lobby, filled with witnesses who had seen the evidence with their own eyes. No reasonable person could watch the security footage or listen to the audio recording and conclude that Patricia had done anything other than attempt to go home after a long day of work. Detective Mitchell took the extraordinary step of placing both Rodriguez and Thompson under immediate arrest for federal civil rights violations. Their badges and weapons were confiscated on the spot, and they were handcuffed in the same lobby where they had attempted to humiliate a federal judge. The irony was not lost on anyone present that these officers were now experiencing the same loss of dignity and freedom that they had tried to impose on an innocent woman. The news media arrived within hours, drawn by tips from courthouse personnel and legal insiders who understood the significance of what had occurred. Federal judges rarely found themselves on the wrong side of police encounters, and when they did, it usually meant that something had gone catastrophically wrong with law enforcement procedures. Reporters gathered outside Meridian Towers, eager to interview residents and witnesses who could shed light on the extraordinary events that had unfolded in the building's elegant lobby. Patricia declined to speak to reporters that evening, choosing instead to focus on documenting the incident and consulting with civil rights attorneys who specialized in police misconduct cases. She understood that her response to this violation would set important precedents for how the judicial system dealt with attacks on its own members. Her decision to pursue the matter through official channels rather than seeking media attention demonstrated her commitment to letting the legal system work rather than trying her case in the court of public opinion. The police department's Internal Affairs Division launched an immediate investigation, but federal authorities quickly took control of the case. When federal judges are illegally detained and harassed, it becomes a matter of national security and judicial independence. The FBI opened a civil rights investigation within 24 hours, and federal prosecutors began reviewing the evidence to determine what charges would be filed against Rodriguez and Thompson. The security footage and audio recordings were turned over to federal investigators who were stunned by the clarity of the evidence and the brazenness of the officers' conduct. Rarely had they seen such a clear-cut case of racial profiling and civil rights violations, complete with multiple forms of documentation that made denial or deflection impossible. The evidence showed not just individual misconduct, but a pattern of behavior suggesting that Rodriguez and Thompson had likely engaged in similar conduct against other victims who lacked Patricia's resources and legal knowledge. Word of the incident spread quickly through the legal community, generating outrage among judges, attorneys, and court personnel who understood the broader implications of what had occurred. If federal judges could be subjected to this kind of treatment, what hope did ordinary citizens have when confronted by officers who viewed certain groups as inherently suspicious or criminal? The incident highlighted persistent problems with racial profiling in law enforcement and the need for better training and accountability measures. Patricia's colleagues on the federal bench rallied around her, offering support and demanding accountability from law enforcement agencies. Several judges issued public statements condemning the officers' conduct and calling for systemic reforms to prevent similar incidents in the future. The judicial community understood that attacks on individual judges were attacks on the independence and integrity of the entire court system. The apartment building's management company found itself in an awkward position, having promised residents a secure environment free from harassment and discrimination. The fact that 2 police officers had been able to detain and humiliate a resident in their own building raised serious questions about security procedures and the screening of law enforcement personnel who entered the property. Building management immediately implemented new policies requiring all police officers to be escorted by security staff and to provide detailed justification for any resident contacts. As news of the incident continued to spread, it became clear that Rodriguez and Thompson's careers in law enforcement were over. No police department would hire officers who had been caught on camera illegally detaining a federal judge, and their actions had created liability issues that would follow them for the rest of their professional lives. The incident would become a case study in police academies and legal schools, an example of how racial bias and poor judgment could destroy careers and violate constitutional rights. Federal prosecutors moved quickly to file charges against both officers, recognizing that the strength of the evidence and the high-profile nature of the case demanded swift action. The charges included deprivation of civil rights under color of law, false imprisonment, and conspiracy to violate constitutional rights. Each charge carried significant prison time, with the potential for sentences that could reach 16 years if the officers were convicted on all counts. The case would send shockwaves through law enforcement communities across the country, serving as a stark reminder that racial profiling and abuse of power would not be tolerated regardless of the victim's race, status, or ability to fight back. Patricia's decision to document the encounter and pursue federal charges would ultimately protect countless future victims who might otherwise suffer in silence. The federal trial that followed became a landmark case in civil rights law, with Rodriguez and Thompson ultimately convicted on all charges after just 4 hours of jury deliberation. The overwhelming evidence made their guilt undeniable, and both officers received the maximum sentence of 16 years in federal prison. Their convictions sent ripples through police departments nationwide, serving as a stark warning that racial profiling would carry devastating consequences. Judge Patricia Williams used her experience to become a powerful advocate for judicial reform and police accountability. She established a foundation dedicated to documenting and preventing racial profiling incidents, ensuring that future victims would have the resources and support needed to seek justice. Her courage in pursuing federal charges, despite the personal cost, inspired countless others to stand up against discrimination. The Meridian Towers incident became required study material in police academies and law schools across the country, a perfect storm of stupidity, racism, and abuse of power that destroyed 2 careers while strengthening the cause of civil rights. Rodriguez and Thompson learned too late that in America, justice doesn't recognize rank or uniform when constitutional rights are violated. This case was brutal, but this case on the right-hand side is even more insane.